This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken from K-State, with part of their Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast, kick off today's show as they converse about amphibians and their development and life cycle. K-State Extension agronomist Tina Sullivan continues the show as she explains green stem in soybeans and how harvest is going in Kansas. Ending the show is K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk discussing new technology he viewed at the World Dairy Expo and how it could help the dairy industry improve efficiencies on the farm. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show with part of a Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode from K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken as they talk about amphibians.
First off, what in the world is an amphibian?
Yeah, we know what amphibians are. They're frogs and salamanders. But if you dive into it a little bit deeper, trying to understand what they are, they're ectothermic. And so that means cold-blooded is how most of us probably know that. They're getting their heat from the environment. So they're going to be really active in warmer months. You're going to slow down when it gets to be colder outside. So they're ectothermic. Most of them undergo metamorphosis. And so frogs, we know when they're little, they're tadpoles, right? And then tadpoles start to grow legs and they become terrestrial. A lot of times they'll switch from being in an aquatic setting to moving into terrestrial habitat. So they need both of those habitats. We're going to talk about why that's important in a little bit. Another really cool feature is that, they breathe secondarily through their skin. So a lot of frogs and salamanders have lungs. There are some species that don't have developed lungs. They breathe entirely through their skin. But that's important because in order to be able to bring that air or that oxygen exchange to the skin, they need to have really thin skin. And they can bring a lot of other things through that skin too that might cause problems for them. So, just some cool characteristics about amphibians.
Sure. So once they're adults, I know a lot of them will spend time out of the water, or maybe a lot of their time out of the water and breathe air. Do they have any adaptations before they metamorphose into adults to allow them to breathe underwater?
They have gills to breathe underwater, yeah. And so most of them have, most tadpoles, most, of the larval stages, the juvenile stages allow them to breathe underwater. When they start going through that metamorphosis, you can see things like, gulping of air. So if you've ever been out to, puddles are common. So a pond that drains down really low, you'll see what a lot of people think are little fish popping at the surface. And a lot of times that's, frog tadpoles that are just going up to the surface and kind of gulping air. So they have the ability to do both. A lot of, some species are really, really good at that. So bullfrog tadpoles are really good at breathing air and staying in environments that aren't great. But yeah, most of them, they're eggs that are laid in the water. They make really long ribbons a lot of times. And those hatch, they breathe the water, breathe the oxygen in the water, and then switch over to lungs when they grow up.
A lot of times we talk about reptiles and amphibians together. So what makes an amphibian different from a reptile?
Yeah, there's a few different things, but one of them is that obligatory aquatic stage. So they have to live in water. They need water to complete their life cycle. That's a really big stage. There's differences in the skin. So amphibians tend to have wet skin. They're breathing through that a lot. Reptiles tend to have a rougher, drier skin. Those are kind of the big characteristics. There's differences in how they breed and a lot of larval characteristics, but those are kind of the big ones. Are they living most of their life on land? Can they complete their life cycle on land, or do they need that aquatic environment to complete their life cycle?
Sure. So you said that there's exchange between the water and the skin of these species for oxygen. I imagine that could also have some implications for these species about water quality.
Yeah, water quality, these amphibians are really good indicators of the water quality. And so they're kind of the canaries in the coal mine a lot of times for aquatic systems. So if we start to see declines in amphibians, that a lot of times can indicate, hey, maybe there's a water quality concern we need to think about. And so it's important to point out that there are other reasons that you might have low numbers of amphibians. So, one of the first things when I walk up to a farm pond that I'm looking at, one of the first things I look at is, are there frogs scattering everywhere around the bank? Because if there are, I can almost instantly tell you that there aren't a lot of largemouth bass in that pond, right? Because if there were a lot of largemouth bass, they'd be eating the tadpoles and they'd be gobbling up those frogs. And so predators are one of the big reasons that we don't see a lot of amphibians around a pond. So just because you don't have them doesn't mean you have poor water quality, but amphibians are really susceptible to declines in water quality. And so things like eutrophication, so adding a bunch of nutrients to a waterway can cause problems. Pesticides, herbicides, certain chemicals that we apply have been shown to impact these amphibian populations. And it's sometimes it's a direct effect. Sometimes it's the chemical that we're adding or the surfactant that we're adding. Other times it's things like, hey, we have so many nutrients in this pond that we're giving off a lot of oxygen during the day and we're using up a lot of oxygen at night. And so our oxygen levels are plummeting to the point that a tadpole can't survive in this little pond that we have, right? And so balancing, kind of the water quality side of things and understanding that there's direct and indirect effects on these critters, I think is really important. But we start to see these declines related to water quality a lot of times, and it's just kind of the first indicator that, hey, maybe something's going on.
What other things might lead to population declines besides just what's happening at and right around my pond?
Worldwide, amphibians have been declining since the 80s. And so it's been a pretty consistent decline for the last 40 or 50 years. And so lots of reasons that we think that's happening. A lot of it's habitat use changes. And so if you think about a lot of our listeners are ranchers or farmers, and the operations that we have, how that's been handled over the last 40 or 50 years has changed a lot, right? And so, if you think about the typical farm, there used to be a lot of, lowland areas or creeks. And again, it doesn't have to be a traditional pond to benefit these amphibians. It can be a low area that collects water and is moist for months at a time or weeks at a time even, right? And so a lot of habitat changes. We've lost some of the ephemeral wetlands that we've had. We've lost some prairie potholes that we have. So a lot of declines in habitat use is probably the biggest reason. Some other things, pesticides. And so we've started to apply different chemicals to our air landscapes. And when those wash into waterways, that can cause issues. There's been studies that have shown tadpole mortality. They're really susceptible to a lot of different chemicals, malformities in adults. But you can see animals that are stressed out in an environment that has contaminants. That stress makes it harder to fight off parasites. So you get some secondary effects like that. There can be changes in, habitat that the eggs need. So if you think about an egg being laid, most eggs are laid in these aquatic environments. But then once those tadpoles hatch, they need to have areas where they can, one, get away and be safe, but two, also, move around enough that they can complete their life cycle. So if you don't have enough vegetation or too much vegetation, that can cause issues as well. Drought, rainfall are issues. There's disease implications. So there's a lot of different reasons that these populations are declining, but those are a lot of the key ones there for sure.
Are there any invasive species that are causing declines for the amphibians? Or on the flip side of that, do we have any amphibians that are also invasive species?
Yeah, both of those are true. So, when we think about invasives, that could be something like a largemouth bass in a pond where it's not native to, right? Yeah. And so if we keep them contained, that's okay. But on that local, that micro habitat level where we're talking about one farm pond, those bass are going to gobble up those tadpoles and frogs. And so that's definitely part of it. Unintended consequences of stocking. So out west, we've seen populations decline. A lot of different amphibians out in the western United States have plummeted to the point that they're either extirpated or very close to it. A lot of that's because we're stocking trout out there, right? And so the fishing opportunity, how does that tie in? It's not something that necessarily we were thinking of when we put those fish in. But sometimes those unintended consequences, bullfrogs are native to our area, but their range is expanding as well. And bullfrogs are ferocious eaters. They'll go out, they'll eat just about anything. They'll eat little birds, they'll eat mice, they'll eat other frogs. They'll just eat anything that goes by them, and they can get really big. The other thing that happens is the tadpoles for bullfrogs are really big too, and they will gobble up everything. And if they're in a happy environment, they can stay a tadpole for a year or two, a really, really long time, a lot longer than most people think. And so they have no reason to become a frog if they're getting all the food and all the oxygen, and they're happy in their environment. They don't have to worry about it drying up and switching to a terrestrial environment. So, those types of things. Cane toads are kind of fun to talk about. They're really big frogs.
Yeah.
Right?
How big?
Well, that's, I don't know how big, a couple pounds or something. Or,
wow.
They're really big. I mean, they make a bullfrog look little, right? So they get to be really big. They're poisonous if they're ingested. So they make animals, they act loopy, really, really drunk, and then it can kill them too. So not fun to be around, but they'll eat anything that comes by them. They were introduced to Florida, and they've just started kind of taking off and causing some issues. So we have non-native species that are definitely causing some problems with these amphibians as a whole.
Once again, that was K-State's Joe Gerken and Drew Ricketts with part of their Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode. If you'd like to listen to the rest of this Amphibians episode, you can do so by searching for Fins, Fur, and Feathers on your favorite podcast platform, following the link in today's show notes on agtoday.net, or by going to wildlife.k-state.edu. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing soybeans with K-State Extension agronomist Tina Sullivan. Tina, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Shelby.
Tina, before we talk about a recent syndrome you've been getting some questions about, how is soybean harvest looking from your perspective?
From everything I've been hearing, soybean harvest has been full bore, full go ahead. Let's get soybeans cut and out of the field, especially between all these rains we've been having and throughout a lot of our soybean growing parts of the state. Whereas the rain has not caused issues like it did earlier this season with flooding of fields, it is now just slowing down harvest in some of those fields because we just can't get out into them as quickly. And what can this kind of late season or end of season moisture do? Kind of just delays when we can get into a field, which then can cause our soybeans to drop too much moisture, which could lead to a dock in price or what the farmer is going to get due to soybeans not being in those optimal moisture levels. But we can also lose a lot of soybeans in the field through the pods shattering or just being flying out the back of the combine, which that's not just money flying out of the combine or being left in the field, but it's also potentially a problem for next year with volunteer soybeans.
And Tina, as we're thinking about this soybean harvest then, is there something you've been getting a few questions about or producers having some concerns about?
So, like many years, this isn't totally out of left field, but we're getting some reports for what's referred to as green stem syndrome. And this in soybeans is the condition where the stem will remain green, where the seeds themselves are mature and ready to harvest. So in some of our fields, we may be seeing those brown pods, but the stems are still that bright green, making harvest a little bit more challenging outside of the rainy conditions. So a hard freeze can kill these leaves and stems, but it can still take some time, especially in these parts of the state where we haven't seen that hard freeze yet. Those green stems to basically not be green.
What causes the stems to remain green then?
So it's likely due to a combination of kind of some early season stress, low pod counts, and then improved late season growing conditions. So maybe we were stressed out, we didn't put as many pods on, and then we suddenly got some very well-timed rain. So the plant itself says, oh, cool, I got what I needed. So in like normal growing conditions, our soybeans are going to accumulate their carbohydrates and proteins in the leaves and stems until we start to form seeds, R5. Those leaves provide the photosynthate or the food the plant needs for those newly formed seeds to begin filling, right? So as we start maturing those beans, the green of those plants from the photosynthetes moves from our leaves and our stems to our pods to those beans inside. In years where we maybe have these low pod counts, we don't have as many beans to fill, we don't have to cannibalize our stem and our leaves as much because it's just not as high demand. There's not as many pods to vegetative material.
So, Tina, even if the stems are still green, those pods and soybeans can be ready to harvest?
They can be if we're already seeing the brown pod, the beans are fully mature at that 13 to 14% moisture that we're trying to aim for harvest. So yes.
Is this a common off-field thing or spots of a field?
And it depends on the field. Sometimes it can be some one-off spots. Sometimes it could be throughout a field. Really just depends on when that stress occurred to cause this green syndrome to occur.
If those stems are still green, does that create issues when you're trying to harvest?
It can. So when we're harvesting green stemmed plants, and it's a slow and it's a messy process. When we're trying to minimize our plugging and header losses, we got to keep our equipment sharp and well maintained. We're going to have to reduce our ground speed to get through those tough stems, especially in those, if it's more of a patchy situation, slow down through those areas so you're not losing all your beans, and expect more residue build up, especially if those leaves are still attached, right? When we think of harvesting beans, we think of a nice, pretty brown field where nothing is left except the pods on the stem. In these green syndrome situations, we're still going to potentially have leaf material on there on top of green stems. So it just kind of slows down that process of getting harvested. To kind of counterbalance green stem syndrome, we still want to harvest them even if they're green as soon as we've hit that seed moisture that we want. Harvest sooner than later because we don't want to lose those seeds, right? If a freeze hasn't occurred, we can suggest chemical desiccants. So think of like a herbicide application to speed up that process. But again, in markets of today, we might not see we're going to get that money back for the application unless it's one of those severe situations where the those beans are ready to go, but we still have so much green material. But it's going to still slow us down because we have to wait on whatever chemical desiccant we use to work.
How fast do we often see the green stem become brown after a freeze? Is it pretty quickly or does it sometimes take a little while?
Like most freeze, like crops and freeze damage, it would be a type of freeze damage, right? It's pretty quick, right? So if you get that freeze, it's going to be faster than really anything else we've got. Western side of the state, even though not typically our soybean growing areas, they've experienced their first hard freeze so far this year. As we're heading into eastern Kansas, where our soybeans are grown, we haven't quite hit those temperatures. Maybe coming up, but we also don't want to leave yield in the field for too long.
And you mentioned obviously soil moisture can make a difference of producers getting docked when they go to the elevator. Anything else you're seeing that might cause producers to get docked as they pull on their semis?
When it comes to soybeans, we usually don't worry about a lot of those, fungal or mold diseases like we do in corn, like aflatoxins. That's been the bigger concern this year with wet cornfields, just kind of growing some mold. When it comes to soybeans, there's typically less. I'm not going to say there's no concern because there's always going to be that one situation, right? But there are a couple diseases that could cause purple staining on the seeds, but it should not cause a dock to those because it's just a color difference. There's not any phytotoxins or aflatoxins like with other molds.
Tina, anything else?
Just be mindful as you're trying to harvest.
Tina, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me.
That was K-State Extension agronomist Tina Sullivan. I will link an agronomy e-update article on this topic in today's show notes on agtoday.net. Before we cut to a break, we're going to be joined by Kansas Wheat's Gordon Clark with a recent wheat scoop.
Recent rains have brought much-needed soil moisture across Kansas, improving prospects for fall wheat stands. But the same weather that restored the soil moisture has also slowed progress, leaving many farmers behind schedule. In central Kansas, Derek Sawyer, chairman of the Kansas Wheat Commission, said planting progress in his area is only about halfway complete. Sawyer stated that KS Providence and AP Prolific are among the most commonly planted varieties this season for his area. Acres are fairly steady so far, but overall, I think the acres will be down because fall harvest has been delayed, Sawyer said. We're up against the deadline for double cropping behind corn or beans. According to K-State wheat production specialist Romulo Lolato, recent rainfall has provided strong moisture reserves, though planting remains well behind normal. We've received quite a bit of rain in the last 2 weeks, with parts of the state close to 5 inches, Lolato said. Once fields dry, that moisture sets us up for good stand establishment. He added that statewide planting progress is about half of the long-term average for this date. While moisture conditions are favorable, the season has also brought reports of fall armyworms. Damage has been mostly to early grazing wheat, but growers are encouraged to watch for pressure on emerging stands. Lolato said fields can often recover if the pressure drops quickly, but replanting may be necessary in heavily affected areas. In northwest Kansas, Chris Tanner, president of the Kansas Association of Wheat Growers, wrapped up drilling by mid-October. He said planted acres in his area are likely down this year after some producers delayed planting due to armyworm pressure. Tanner seeded AP Sunbird and KS Bill Snyder, noting that recent rains made conditions ideal for finishing the job. After a dry stretch like we've had, it feels great to drill into this kind of moisture, Tanner said. Concerns about wheat streak mosaic virus remain high as cooler weather slows volunteer control. K-State wheat pathologist Kelsey Anderson Onofre said later flushes of volunteer wheat near planting are generally lower risk. K-State's agronomy e-update reports that planting in late October to early November remains acceptable in southeast and far south central Kansas, but is considered late in other areas and falls beyond full crop insurance coverage. Research from Garden City shows that delaying planting from October 1 to November 1 can delay heading by 6 days and reduce yield by about 23%. To offset the effects of late planting, agronomists recommend increasing seeding rates, maintaining a planting depth of 1 to 1.5 inches, and applying starter phosphorus fertilizer with seed. About 20 to 30 pounds per acre of phosphorus is advised to promote early growth and tillering. For more information on late planting management and fall fertility, visit K-State Agronomy's e-update or contact your local extension office. For Kansas Wheat, this is Gordon Clark.
As always, you can find out more information about Kansas Wheat by going to their website, kswheat.com. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back.
Welcome back, and thanks for joining us on Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's Milk Lines. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk recently attended the World Dairy Expo, where he viewed some of the technology being developed for the dairy industry. He says that one area that's been a problem is DHIA testing, a milk testing program that analyzes milk supplies for fat, protein, and other factors to help producers manage their herds. The problem has been that it disrupts normal operations. Mike says this new technology that he saw is using inline sensors mounted to each milking stall without disrupting normal operations to collect the data that dairy farmers need, which he says will greatly improve efficiency on the dairy.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy industry concerning some technology that we might be able to utilize on our dairy farms here, hopefully in just a few short years. You know, one of the interesting things at the World Dairy Expo is I got to review some of the things that some of our milking manufacturers and other suppliers of technology are doing to try to help us here in the dairy industry. As we look at our dairy industry, one of the things that we've really gotten away from on many of our dairy farms is DHIA testing. And it's for a variety of reasons that we have seen that happen. And one of the things that has happened on our large dairies is the fact that when we come in and do DHIA testing, we actually disrupt the milking process for that day. Well, that increases the milking time, and as a result of that, that puts us behind on the dairy, all across the dairy, not just in the milking parlor. So if we lose an hour or 2 hours one day, we have to try to gain that back in future days, and sometimes it takes 4 to 5 days to actually recover the schedule for the whole farm. So this schedule includes when we feed animals, when we do herd health, when we do breeding, as well as other activities on the farm. So it really disrupts the whole dairy, and it does come at a cost. So one of the neat things that I got to view in several different forms is the new technology that companies are proposing that we use to determine things like the fat, the protein, milk urea nitrogen, somatic cell in the milk, and it's done through inline sensors that are mounted at milking stalls. So there's no disruption to the milking process to collect this type of data. In addition to some of the milk components and major things that we might measure for DHIA testing, we're also looking at things like progesterone and maybe even pregnancy-associated glycoproteins so that we can actually do pregnancy testing based off of the milk that is flowing through those milking systems each day on an individual cow basis. So as we look at some of the ways this technology might be adopted in the future, it could really change how we manage our dairy farms. It could actually improve our efficiencies greatly because now we would not necessarily have to pull milk samples to determine some of these things, or blood samples, or maybe in the case of pregnancy detection, the use of detection with armed services from a veterinarian or others on our dairy farm. So it is really quite exciting to see how this technology will evolve in the next few years and how we will adopt it on our dairy farms really across the United States, not just here in Kansas. I think it does have a possibility of greatly improving our efficiencies because right now on many of our farms, we really actually have no idea of the component yields of individual animals because we do not have the data. So as we gain technology that will help us determine these components without disrupting our milking process, I think it will greatly improve our ability to select those animals that are really most efficient on our dairy farms. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy industry to keep an eye out for the new technology that will help us in determining milk components in the future.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.